Welcome back to God's Story and the final episode of Christmas, a Sacred Journey to Salvation. Let's call Israel the national holiday of nature. Over the past episodes, we've seen prophecy spoken, journeys undertaken, and miracles performed. Today, we bring it all together as Simeon's words echo through time, reminding us that the light of Christ is not only for Bethlehem, but for all nations. Let's complete this sacred journey.
The temple's great stone walls stood silent in the pale morning light, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of touch and weather. Shadows played along the arched doorways, and the faint murmur of prayers rose like mist, curling around the pillars and reaching for the heavens. This was no ordinary day, though. A deep expectancy hung in the air, unseen but felt in the marrow of those who stepped within the sacred threshold. Simeon, old and bent but steady in purpose, moved with the deliberate gait of a man whose steps were numbered yet meaningful. His hands, gnarled and worn, clutched a staff that tapped against the stone floor, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in the temple's vast expanse. His eyes, clouded by age, were yet keen with an inner light. Today, he knew, was the day. He had waited, oh, how he had waited, years spent watching, praying, hoping. The Lord had whispered to him, not in thunder or flame, but in the quiet assurance of a promise. He would not taste death before his eyes beheld the Messiah. That promise had sustained him through lonely nights and uncertain days. And now, as the scent of incense mingled through the high windows, he felt the weight of that promise lifting. The child entered, cradled in the arms of a young woman whose face bore the weariness of new motherhood and the peace of infinite grace. Her husband walked beside her, his hands roughened by labor but gentle as they guided her steps. They were simple people, unremarkable to the world, yet radiating a quiet dignity that drew Simeon's eyes like a flame draws a moth. He approached them, his movements unhurried but sure, as though propelled by something greater than himself. When his gaze fell upon the child, his breath caught. This was no ordinary child. There was a presence, a light, not visible but felt as one feels the sun's warmth on a cold day. The mother offered the child to him, her hands trembling slightly. Simeon took the boy, his own hands surprisingly steady. The child was light in his arms, yet there was a gravity, a weight of purpose that seemed to settle over them both. He lifted his face to the heavens, and his voice rang out, worn by years, yet resonant with conviction. "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace, according to your word," he began, his words steady, deliberate, and full of awe. "For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." As he spoke, tears traced the lines of his weathered face, not of sorrow but of joy so profound it bordered on pain. Around him the temple seemed to hold its breath. Even the murmurs of prayer fell silent, as if the very stones listened. For in that moment, the ancient promise of God met the fragile reality of human hope, and the two became one. "Nothing." Simeon returned the child to his mother, his eyes meeting hers. There was an understanding between them, unspoken yet clear. He nodded once, a gesture heavy with meaning, and turned away, his heart full. The staff tapped rhythmically as he walked, a sound of completion, of fulfillment. And so the light had come, not with fanfare or spectacle, but in the arms of a young mother and the faith of an old man. Yet it was a light destined to pierce the darkness and change the course of history forever. The temple grew quieter as the light of the day filtered through the latticework above, painting shifting patterns on the stone floor. Mary stood apart from the crowd, cradling her infant son, her head bowed in a posture of contemplation. Her figure, slight and cloaked in simple garments, seemed almost to blend into the ancient walls around her. In her arms rested the culmination of promises whispered through generations. She looked down at her son, his tiny face serene, untouched by the weight of what lay ahead. His eyes, when they opened, held a depth that startled her, though he was just a baby. Mary had spent countless nights pondering the angel's words, the shepherd's testimony, and now, the prophecy of this elderly man, Simeon. His voice still echoed in her ears, each syllable heavy with divine purpose. Her mind swirled with questions she dared not speak aloud. How would this child be a light for all nations? What did it mean for a sword to pierce her own soul? The questions were like shadows flickering in the corners of her heart, never fully taking shape yet always present. She knew she would not have the answers, not now, perhaps not ever, but there was peace in her uncertainty, a quiet resolve rooted in her faith. She shifted her hold on the child, pressing him closer to her chest. The warmth of his small body was a balm to her thoughts. Around her, the world moved on. Merchants outside the temple shouted their wares. The bleating of sacrificial lambs mingled with the hum of distant conversation, and children darted through the courtyards, their laughter ringing like bells. Yet for Mary, time seemed to stand still, the moment expanding to hold both the weight of history and the fragile beauty of the present. Joseph stood nearby, his eyes watchful. He, too, bore the quiet strength of a man carrying a burden he did not fully understand, but bore willingly. His hands, calloused and worn, rested on the hilt of his staff. He had no words for Mary, nor she for him, but their shared silence spoke volumes. Mary's thoughts returned to Simeon's parting words, "A light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink deeper into her spirit. She did not know what lay ahead, but she felt the presence of God, a guiding hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Opening her eyes, she gazed again at her son. His tiny hand had slipped free from the folds of his swaddling cloth, reaching into the space before him. Mary smiled faintly, her lips curving with a tenderness that softened the uncertainty in her heart. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers brushing his delicate skin. "Yes," she whispered to herself, "I will treasure these things in my heart." For what else could she do but hold these moments, these words, and this child close, like seeds planted in the soil of her soul, waiting for the time they would bloom into understanding. The temple's light shifted again, marking the passage of time. But for Mary, it was not time to leave. Not yet. She lingered, absorbing the sacred stillness, carrying within her the weight of the prophecy, the hope of the nations, and the love of a mother. The yews had a way of weaving themselves into stories, their threads forming patterns only visible in hindsight. The child who once lay in the manger, swaddled in simplicity, was now a man walking under the same sky, but with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The echoes of angelic songs sung over Bethlehem had faded into memory, replaced by the murmur of crowds and the soft sighs of those in need. The dusty roads of Galilee stretched before him, winding through fields of wheat that swayed like golden seas in the breeze. Jesus walked these roads with the ease of familiarity, yet his every step carried purpose. His disciples trailed behind, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion, their questions hanging in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Who was this man they followed? A carpenter's son, yet a teacher whose words pierced hearts and whose hands brought healing. In one village, a woman approached him, her child clinging to her skirts. Her face bore the marks of sleepless nights, her eyes pools of worry. She knelt before him, her voice trembling. "Lord, my son is ill. No healer can help him." Jesus knelt beside the boy, his touch gentle, his gaze steady. The child looked up, his pallor fading like a shadow receding from the light. The mother wept, her tears falling like rain on parched soil. Jesus rose, offering no grand proclamation, only a quiet smile that spoke of love too vast for words. And so it went, from one village to the next. The blind saw, the lame walked, and the broken found wholeness. Yet not all welcomed him. In the synagogues, whispers grew into accusations. Who was this man who claimed authority over the law? Who dared to forgive sins? Jesus bore it all: the adoration of the masses, the skepticism of the learned, the quiet hatred of those who saw him as a threat. His words, though simple, carried the weight of eternity. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He spoke not of conquest or power, but of a kingdom built on love, mercy, and truth. The disciples marveled at his teachings, their minds struggling to grasp the depth of his words. Peter, ever impetuous, often spoke out, "Lord, how can this be? The kingdom must come with power." Jesus would look at him, not in rebuke, but in understanding. "Peter, you see but in time, you will see fully." Evenings were quieter, the roads empty save for their small band. They would gather around a fire, its light flickering on their tired faces. Jesus would speak softly, his voice a balm to their weariness. He told them of seeds and soils, of lamps and baskets, of sheep and shepherds. Each story held a truth, wrapped in simplicity, yet profound enough to linger in their thoughts long after the flames died down. For this was his mission, not to conquer, but to teach, to heal, and to prepare. The light that had shone in the stable now walked among men, illuminating paths hidden by the shadows of the world. And though the road ahead would lead to a hill far darker than the starlit night of his birth, he walked it with a quiet resolve. For this was why he had come. The same resignation. The hill was barren, its earth cracked and dry under the weight of countless footsteps. Golgotha, they called it, the place of the skull. A cruel name for a cruel place. The air hung heavy, as if the heavens themselves mourned what was unfolding. Shadows lengthened despite the midday sun, casting jagged lines across the ground. Jesus hung on the cross, his body broken, his breaths labored. The crowd below was a mix of mockery and grief. Pharisees with their sneers, soldiers with their indifference, and a scattering of women whose eyes shone with tears. Among them stood Mary, his mother, her face pale but resolute. She had carried him once in her womb, and now she carried the weight of his suffering in her heart. The sound of a hammer striking a nail still echoed in her ears, a cruel rhythm she would never forget. Yet even in her anguish, she held on to the words spoken to her all those years ago. "A sword will pierce your soul." And now she understood. It was not just her soul that bore the piercing, but the soul of the world. Jesus' voice, weak yet clear, broke through the murmur of the crowd. "Father, forgive them," he said, his eyes lifting toward the sky, "for they know not what they do." The soldiers paused, their hands mid-motion, as if stunned by the words of a man who should have been consumed by pain. The crowd quieted, the weight of his words hanging over them like a cloud. "No." At the foot of the cross, John stood, his fists clenched, his face a storm of sorrow and confusion. "Why?" he whispered, the question falling into the silence. Mary placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle, grounding. She did not answer, for what answer could there be? Only the silent knowledge that this was not the end. Hours passed, each moment stretching into eternity. The sun dimmed, its lights swallowed by an unnatural darkness. Jesus' head fell forward, his final words a whisper. "It is finished." The earth trembled as if in protest, stones cracking, and the veil of the temple tearing from top to bottom. But even in the darkness, there was a glimmer, a flicker of something eternal. The centurion, standing guard, looked up at the lifeless form of the man on the cross. His face, hardened by years of war, softened. "Surely," he murmured, "this was the Son of God." 3 days later the light returned, not as a faint glimmer, but as a blaze that no shadow could extinguish. The tomb, once sealed with finality, now stood open, its stone rolled away. The women who came to anoint the body found not death, but life, not despair, but hope. The angel's words echoed in the stillness of the morning. He is not here, he has risen. That light, the one that first shone in the stable and was seemingly extinguished on the cross, now burned brighter than ever. It was a light that no darkness could overcome, a light that transformed sorrow into joy and despair into hope. In the days that followed, the disciples would carry this light, their fear replaced by courage, their doubt by faith. It spread like wildfire, reaching hearts across generations, across continents, and across time. It is a light that still burns today, undying and eternal, calling out to all who seek it. The shepherd sat alone on the hillside, his form silhouetted against the soft glow of twilight. The day had faded into a tapestry of gold and violet, the kind of sky that made even the most hardened of hearts pause. His staff rested across his knees, its wood smooth from years of use, and his gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first stars began to appear. He had walked this path many times and watched these stars for countless nights. Yet tonight felt different, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The memories came unbidden, like leaves carried on the wind. He could still recall the night when the sky had blazed with a light unlike any other, when the angels' voices had filled the air with a song so pure it brought tears to his eyes. He smiled faintly, the lines on his weathered face deepening. That night had changed everything. They had hurried to the stable, their breath visible in the cold, their hearts pounding with a mixture of awe and disbelief. And there, amidst the humble surroundings, they had found him. A child, wrapped in cloth, lying in a manger. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The shepherd leaned back, his eyes scanning the heavens. He had often wondered why they, simple shepherds, had been chosen to witness such a moment. They were not scholars or priests, not men of power or influence. They were keepers of sheep, their lives measured in seasons and cycles of the flock. Yet the angels had come to them, bringing tidings of great joy. His thoughts drifted to the years that followed. The boy had grown, and with him the light that seemed to emanate from his very being. News of his teachings, his miracles, had spread like wildfire. The blind saw, the lame walked, and the hopeless found hope. The shepherd had watched from afar, his heart swelling with pride and wonder. But there had been sorrow too, an ache that came with knowing the weight the boy, now a man, carried. He traced a finger along the grooves of his staff, his mind returning to the present. The journey had not been easy. There had been darkness, moments when the light seemed all but extinguished, but always, always it had returned, stronger than before. He thought of the cross, the tomb, and the empty grave. The light that had first shone in the stable had not been extinguished. It had only grown brighter. The shepherd's gaze fell to the small flame of his lantern, flickering against the gathering night. He reached out and cupped it with his hand, shielding it from the wind. The light was fragile, yet enduring, much like the hope it symbolized. He thought of the generations to come, of the countless lives that would be touched by the story he had been privileged to witness. He stood, his joints protesting, but his resolve firm. The stars now dotted the sky, their lights steady and eternal. He turned toward the village where others waited to hear his story. He had told it many times, yet he knew he would tell it again and again, as long as there were ears to listen and hearts to receive. "For I have seen the light," he whispered to the night, his voice steady, "and I know it shines for all." And he gasped out a sigh. The old shepherd stood beneath a sky alive with stars, their light piercing the velvet darkness like 1,000 promises. His hands, roughened by years of tending flocks, rested on the crook of his staff. He gazed upward, his eyes reflecting the heavens as though searching for something beyond the visible. "It calls to you," he began, his voice steady but soft, as though he was speaking directly to the stars. "The light. It called to us that night, and it calls to you still. The shepherd shifted his weight, his feet finding stability on the uneven ground. Around him, the night was still, save for the occasional whisper of the wind through the grass. He could feel the weight of the years, but his heart was lighter than it had been in a long time. "I was just a boy when it happened," he continued, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of a storyteller. "A boy with no thought of angels or kings. Yet on that night, the heavens opened and we saw a light that changed everything. A light that led us to a child who was more than we could understand." He paused, his fingers tightening on the staff. The memories were as vivid as the night itself. He could still see the stable, the glow of the lantern, the quiet strength of the young mother, and the awe in the faces of the others. "The years passed as they always do," he said. "That child grew into a man whose words could calm storms and whose touch could heal the broken. I watched from afar as his light spread, touching lives in ways I never imagined. And then, there was the cross." His voice faltered, the memory of that day heavy in the air. It was the darkest moment, when it seemed the light had been snuffed out. But even then, it wasn't gone. No, it was only preparing to shine brighter than ever. The tomb could not hold it, death could not claim it. That light returned, and it has never left. The shepherd turned his gaze downward, his eyes meeting those of the people gathered before him. They sat in a loose circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Young and old, they leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and reverence. "This light," he said, his voice rising slightly, "is not just for shepherds on a hillside or kings in a palace. It is for all of us, for you, for me, for anyone willing to follow it. It is a light that calls us to hope, to love, to believe." He lifted his staff, pointing it toward the sky. "Do you see the stars? They shine not because the darkness allows them, but because the light refuses to be overcome. That is the light I speak of, the light of Him who came to save us." The shepherd's voice softened as he lowered his staff. "I cannot make you follow it. I can only tell you of the journey, of the joy and the peace it brings. The rest is up to you." The circle remained silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Slowly, one by one, heads nodded, and the faintest whispers of agreement filled the air. The shepherd smiled, a deep, knowing smile. His words had found their mark. He turned once more to the sky, his heart full. "The light is here," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, "and it will always be here." The night sky was vast, its expanse dotted with countless stars that seemed to shimmer in harmony with the quiet hum of the earth. Amid this celestial orchestra, one star outshone the rest. It hung low on the horizon, its light steady and resolute, as if guiding all who dared to look upward. Beneath that star, the landscape stretched out in undulating waves of shadow and light. Hills rose and fell like the rhythm of a breath, their curves softened by the faint glow of the heavens. The world seemed to pause, wrapped in a hushed stillness that whispered of something eternal. In the distance, the silhouette of a cross stood stark against the sky, its shape both solemn and triumphant. At its base, the faint outline of a figure could be seen, cloaked in shadow but illuminated by the star's unwavering light. It was a reminder, a bridge between the cradle and the cross, between a beginning marked by humility and an ending crowned with victory. The light of the star began to blend with another source, a softer, warmer glow. It was the light of a candle, held aloft by trembling hands. Around it, more candles appeared, their flames flickering but persistent. One by one, the lights grew, until they formed a circle of warmth and hope. A voice rose within the circle, clear and steady. It was a song, ancient yet timeless, its melody weaving through the still air. Others joined in, their voices blending in a harmony that carried the weight of centuries. The words spoke of glory and peace, of a love that descended to earth and a light that refused to be extinguished. As the songs swelled, the light from the candles seemed to grow, pushing back the shadows. The cross, once cloaked in darkness, now stood bathed in a radiant glow. The star above burned brighter still, its light mingling with the earthbound flames in a dance of unity. The figure beneath the cross raised a hand, not to command, but to invite. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a power that could not be denied. And so, one by one, those who stood in the circle stepped forward. Their candles held high, they placed them at the foot of the cross, their flames joining in a single blazing light. The scene was one of profound simplicity, yet it held the weight of a story that spanned generations. It spoke of a promise fulfilled, of a hope that had traveled from the manger to the hill and now reached into the hearts of all who would receive it. The light grew until it filled the night, its brilliance reflecting in the eyes of those who gathered. And then, as if carried by an unseen wind, the light began to spread. It traveled beyond the hill, flowing into valleys and over mountains, reaching villages and cities, touching lives in ways unseen but deeply felt. The star, its work complete, began to fade, its light merging with the dawn that now crept over the horizon. Yet its message remained, written not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who had seen it. And so, the story did not end, but continued, carried forward by the light that had come into the world, a light that no darkness could overcome.
Thank you for walking with us through Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. If this series has touched your heart, please share it far and wide and let us know your reflections in the comments below. Subscribe to God's Story and stay connected for more inspiring stories to come. Remember, the light of Christmas continues to shine in each of us. Until next time, stay blessed.